The chairman will call the committee to order. For my colleagues and for those assembled, the plan is to conduct opening statements. We have competing hearings, one upstairs that's pretty well attended. So we'll get through the opening statements, and then we'll wait until that hearing ends. I will call up the bill, and then we'll hold off for amendments and stuff until afterwards. So I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Today, our subcommittee will mark up legislation that will provide certainty to producers and recyclers of coal combustion byproducts, while also ensuring the safe and appropriate disposal and monitoring of coal combustion byproducts, or CCRs. Since the very first hearing in this subcommittee, regulation of CCRs have been a topic of discussion, coal combustion residues. We learned early on that regulating coal combustion residues as a hazardous waste when these materials do not even meet EPA's own standard for toxicity would have devastating effects on jobs and a very successful and emerging byproducts industry. At the same time, this proposed overregulation by the Environmental Protection Agency will raise utility prices for families across the country. We heard firsthand from a utility manager in my district the immediate impact would be a 25% increase in the cost to consumers. With the economy sputtering, we can't afford to have jobs put at risk because of the political appointees think it's a good idea. In our legislative hearing on H.R. 1391, independent experts testified further on the inability of coal combustion residue to reach the threshold necessary for regulation as a hazardous material, even though EPA is claiming it is. Further, the witnesses called into serious question whether the Obama Environmental Protection Agency actually gave appropriate consideration to important practical factors that, if done, would have radically altered its final decision. I am not suggesting government should take a holiday on these matters. When it comes to oversight and protection from risk, there is no doubt it is the government's responsibility to check on these activities. The question becomes, who is the appropriate monitor? State officials affirm their expertise and desire to regulate this area without federal control. Given the unique challenges of each individual state, I believe this is the best approach. The legislation therefore creates a new subsection to Subtitle D of the Solid Waste Disposal Act. That establishes targeted authority to address the management and disposal of coal combustion residues at landfills, surface impoundments, and other land-based units. This program, which will be led by the states, or EPA if the state cannot or does not want to operate it, will for the first time ever create national enforceable requirements for groundwater monitoring, liners at landfills, corrective action when environmental damage occurs, and structural stability criteria to prevent issues like the one that caused the problems at Tennessee Valley Authority in Tennessee. In working with stakeholders, we have received broad support for this legislation, including state environmental officials, the Beneficial Use Committee, and other regulated stakeholders. And I want to place into the record two letters, one from the Edison Electric Institute and US SWAG from the industry, and also ECOS, which is the Environmental Council of the states, both supporting this legislation. They all believe the provisions in this bill will protect jobs, encourage economic growth and job creation, and prevent unnecessary higher energy prices and construction costs. I want to thank Representative McKinley for his leadership, as well as Representative Latta for his efforts on the subcommittee to move this jobs legislation forward. As we move this bill to full committee consideration, I hope we can work with all members to present a bipartisan bill to the full House. And with that, I've finished my time, and I yield back. I'd like to now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Green from Texas, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I find it unfortunate we're wasting our opportunity to demonstrate a rare moment of bipartisanship today. Our subcommittee held legislative hearing on April 15th on the original legislation by Representative McKinley. In that hearing, I believe the general consensus was the path forward on the issue of regulating coal ash was to be done under Subtitle 2 of RCRA, and to work together to come to an agreement. Despite member-level discussions between myself and you, along with Chairman Emeritus Dingell, we've been unable to have substantial staff-level discussions on a bipartisan agreement on the bill before the subcommittee today. I find it disheartening that the majority has said they wish to work with us, but they still sent around a new bill before they answered questions posed by our staff for potential negotiations. This bill leaves a lot to be desired and clearly has a lot of kinks that need to be worked out. After reading it, though, I'm more confused as to how this program will work and even more confused by the role of the EPA and their responsibilities as well as authority under the new legislation. I think there are a lot of questions that need to be answered and clarifications need to be made in order for the legislation to be successful. Right now, as I see it, the bill is like fitting a square peg into a round hole and ultimately setting this program up for failure. The last thing we want to do is direct the EPA and the states to do something that isn't going to work. Now this could be what our colleagues on the other side of the aisle are hoping for, but I don't see how this helps either our industry or the environment. Mr. Chairman, my staff's reached out to your staff to sit down and work on the legislation and hopefully come to some sort of agreement. I'm hoping these conversations will be more productive than last week. We're here to work on a common sense solution and not waste precious committee time punting bills to the Senate that have zero chance of passing. And I thank you, and I'll yield to any of my Democratic colleagues that would like the remainder of my time. Okay. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair recognizes the Chairman Emeritus, Mr. Barton, for 3 minutes.
For how long? 3?
I'm told 3.
3, okay. First of all, Mr. Chairman, I want to commend you and the ranking member on the minority for both sides playing by the rules last week. I think we ought to commend the minority staff and their leadership for finding the technical error and pointing it out. And I want to commend you and Chairman Upton for honoring the rule and withdrawing it so we could fix it. It shows the institutional integrity of the committee and the leadership on both sides. And while it has delayed the issue being addressed, it shows that the Energy and Commerce Committee plays by the rules. So I'm very supportive of what happened last week. On the issue before us, the Recycling Coal Combustion Residuals Accessibility Act of 2011 and the Coal Residuals Reuse and Management Act bill. This is something that needs to be addressed. I do not believe that coal ash is a hazardous material in the most technical sense of the word. Subtitle C of RCRA created a hazardous waste management program that, among other things, directs the EPA to develop criteria for identifying and managing all waste deemed to be hazardous to human health and the environment. Subtitle D of RCRA established state and local governments as the primary planning, regulating, and implementing entities. So under RCRA, it's the state that's preeminent, not the EPA. EPA, though, has decided that it should be preeminent, and they are now proposing to regulate coal ash under RCRA for the first time. They have prepared 2 alternative options to do so. I do not support what EPA is trying to do, nor does the bill before us. So it is time to hold this markup, and I believe that when we get to the actual markup, we'll find bipartisan support for the bill. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I put my full statement in the record and would yield back or yield to whoever you think I should.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes Chairman Emeritus, Mr. Waxman, for 3 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, disposal of toxic coal ash is a serious issue, and it deserves a more effective response than this bill offers. The Kingston coal ash spill in 2008 is a dramatic example of our failure to properly address coal ash waste. At hearings in this committee, we've heard testimony about the devastating impacts contamination from these wastes can cause. We've learned of contaminated drinking water supplies and ruined property values. We've learned that improper disposal of coal ash can both present catastrophic risks from ruptures of containment structures and cause cancer and other illnesses from long-term exposure to leaking chemicals. Last year, the U.S. EPA proposed regulations to ensure stronger oversight of coal ash impoundments in order to prevent disasters like the one at Kingston and to protect groundwater and drinking water from the threat of contamination. The agency has offer two alternative proposals to regulate coal combustion residuals. One proposal is to regulate these wastes under Subtitle C of the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, or RCRA, as a hazardous waste. The other proposal is to regulate under Subtitle D of RCRA as a non-hazardous solid waste. Under both proposals, the wet impoundments, like in Kingston, would be phased out. Under both, disposal of residuals would require basic controls like the use of liners, groundwater monitoring, dust control, and other engineering measures. My view is that regulation under Subtitle C would most effectively address this issue. But many stakeholders have sought a hybrid approach, one that would offer the protections of Subtitle C regulation without a hazardous designation. Such an approach would require a legislative solution, what many have called a D+ option. I offered to compromise to reach such a solution because I believe our committee should work together to craft solutions to problems, but these overtures were rejected. As a result, we considered one-sided legislation that will protect utility company profits at the expense of public health. This bill is a D- approach. It says coal ash containing toxic chemicals like arsenic, lead, and mercury will be subject to fewer controls than ordinary household garbage. If this legislation is adopted, no one should be fooled. This bill will not protect public health. There's one other issue I want to mention. When the committee organized last year, the Chairman Upton announced that a central policy in deciding what legislation is scheduled for consideration in committee will be compliance with a discretionary cut-go rule. This seems to be ignored in this process today. Instead, we'll be told the legislation before us is somehow without cost. On the other hand, we will hear that there are no unfunded mandates in the bill because state action is voluntary. Then we will hear that the program won't require any EPA resources because it will be implemented by the states. This is a shell game. I urge my colleagues to oppose the bill, which puts human health and the environment at risk.
Gentleman yields back his time. Who seeks time on the majority side? Mr. Harper is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I thank you for bringing H.R. 1391 to the subcommittee for a vote today. I believe that the hearing held by this subcommittee on the legislation highlighted the need for the Congress to take quick action. Mr. Chairman, I see the apparent intention of the EPA to regulate coal ash as a hazardous material as another decision by the agency to regulate business without the use of facts or common sense. And I'm happy that this bill will halt that attempt. We all want a clean environment, but decisions on how to keep it clean should be based on science, not political rhetoric. And those decisions should not be made at the cost of good-paying American jobs. My district relies on coal and coal ash for jobs and electricity, and I will happily support H.R. 1391 to protect the interests of my constituents. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Wisconsin, Ms. Baldwin, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to start by thanking you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Green, along with each of your staffs for working with my office on this issue over the past few days. The regulations in my home state of Wisconsin are viewed literally as the gold standard for handling coal combustion wastes. There are no wet ponds in Wisconsin. Our dry landfills are properly lined, covered, and monitored, and there is a strong beneficial reuse program in place. In fact, a utility in my home state, We Energies, has an average beneficial use rate of 96%. and actually achieved a utilization rate close to 110% in 2010. You may ask, how can you achieve 110%? The way the company has achieved this extraordinarily high utilization rate is that they are one of only a few utilities around the country currently recovering coal ash from existing landfills and reburning the ash. This then results in high-quality ash used in concrete, cement, bricks, and additional byproducts. I want to thank the chairman for incorporating an amendment that I authored into the base text of the legislation that's before us today. My amendment will ensure that companies like We Energies who are reclaiming coal ash from landfills have the clarification they need to continue their successful ash reuse program. I note my time is running out, but I do want to note that we are not yet at a point where I can support the underlying bill, and do hope that we will be able to achieve some modifications as we move forward, because I do ultimately want to be a part of this solution. So I look forward to working with the majority and minority to present a workable alternative.
Gentlelady yields back her time. The chair now recognizes anyone else on the majority side speak time for an opening statement. If not, chair then turns to the minority side. Anyone seeking time for an opening statement? Chair now calls up the Coal Residual Reuse and Management Act and asks the clerk to report.
A bill to amend Subtitle D of the Solid Waste Disposal Act to facilitate recovery and beneficial use and provide for the proper management and disposal of materials generated by the combustion of coal and other fossil fuels.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with, and the bill will be open to amendment at any point, so ordered. And the chair now recesses the committee pending the conclusion of the healthcare hearing. subcommittee will come to order. If I have my colleagues on my side find their seats or move their conversations into the cloakroom. When we recessed, the chair had called up the bill. The clerk reported the bill, and without objection, the reading of the bill was dispensed with. So now I'd like to, as per the chairman's announced policy, ask for any bipartisan amendments to the bill, if there are any. Seeing none, the chair now would like to ask, are there any amendments to the bill? Mr. Chair recognizes, for what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
I have an amendment, Mr. Chair.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Number 7.
An amendment offered by Mr. Waxman of California.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I'm offering this amendment to provide a specific authorization for this program as required by the chairman's policies. I have sought information from the EPA and CBO in preparing this amendment, and it's clear that this program will have a significant price tag. The bill creates a new program to be administered by EPA. EPA would be required to review notices and certifications and oversee the program. Where states adopt a program, EPA will need to ensure they are sufficient. When EPA receives information that a state is failing to properly carry out a permit program, EPA will need to have the necessary resources to send staff to the state and conduct sufficient oversight to determine whether the state is actually permitting disposal sites. In states that elect not to adopt a program, EPA would have to step in to establish a permit program and ensure that the permits are enforced. Despite these new and significant duties on the agency, this legislation does not include an authorization. It therefore implicitly also authorizes appropriations of such sums as may be necessary to implement the program. This is a violation of the policies announced by Chairman Upton when the committee organized earlier this year. While my amendment does not fix this bill's discretionary cut-go problem, it ensures that the bill complies with Chairman Upton's requirement for a specific authorization. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this amendment.
And the gentleman yields back his time. The chair recognizes himself in opposition to the amendment. 1 year ago, the EPA proposed 2 alternative plans for a whole new regulation of coal ash. One would have designated it as hazardous. The other would have created a new regulatory scheme on Subtitle D of RCRA. Both would have had substantial new federal programs requiring significant resources. Yet EPA apparently planned to carry them out using otherwise available funds in RCRA. In fact, the EPA detailed budget justification for both fiscal year 2011 and 2012 contained no new money for coal ash. Unlike the EPA proposals, our bill places almost all the ministerial duties for carrying out coal ash management programs on the states, in line with their already robust municipal solid waste programs. And the municipal solid waste programs in the states are already approved so it won't be necessary to start from scratch from the EPA. Authorizing new funding would definitely present a cut-go problem under the majority leader's protocol, which we do not need going forward. The amendment is neither needed nor helpful, and I urge my colleagues to reject it.
Will the gentleman yield?
I would yield.
I just want to say that, and I stand in opposition to the amendment as well, and I just want to say that we were actually, had the markup proceeded last week as scheduled, and based on the amendment that we saw that was at the desk by Mr. Waxman, we were actually prepared to accept that amendment and would have done so, I think, on a voice vote. There is no such sums in this bill. At least informally, the CBO has told us that there's no, that any cost is de minimis. But in fact, if CBO tells us that there is a score that needs to be offset, we'd certainly find it. And yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back his time to me. Anyone else on my side seeking recognition? If not, I yield back the balance of my time.
Just,
Anyone else?
Mr. Chairman, would you yield to me?
I would yield.
The bill on page 2 says each state may adopt and implement a program. Now, that's voluntary. But then if they don't adopt it, then it's up to the EPA, as I mentioned in my opening comments in support of this amendment, to carry out the work. We are giving them new work to do in this legislation. This is not the RCRA law. This is a new bill to give them more responsibilities under RCRA to be sure that this job is done. I think that you may call it de minimis, but that's going to require appropriations. And if we're putting in place a bill that would require the agency to do more, then I think we have to authorize that sum. I am curious to know why Chairman Upton said he was prepared to accept this before, but not today.
Not this amendment, the gentleman will yield. The amendment that you had at the desk last week, which is different than this amendment, we were planning to accept it.
I see.
But it was not this.
Well, I regret, Mr. Chairman, that you and Mr. Upton oppose this amendment. I think it's consistent with the rules that you've set in place, and I would urge its adoption.
Anyone else seeking the balance of my time? Seeing no one, I would yield back my time. Anyone else seeking time in support or in opposition of the amendment? Hearing none, the vote now occurs on the amendment offered by Mr. Waxman. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. Who seeks recognition? The chair, for what purpose, gentlelady from Wisconsin rise?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Ms. Baldwin of Wisconsin.
Thanks.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes in support of her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me first state that the amendment in the nature of a substitute that is going to be circulated in a moment is substantially similar to, but not identical to, the original H.R. 1391, the McKinley bill that many on this committee are co-authors of. Simply put, this amendment would allow EPA to go forward with their Subtitle D proposal. However, this amendment would allow a state to designate coal combustion residuals under Subtitle C of RCRA if the state determined that it is warranted. This is the same approach taken in the base bill that we are working off of today. To be clear, under my amendment, the EPA administrator may not regulate coal combustion residuals under Subtitle C of RCRA. This is in line with what the utility and advocates of beneficial reuse have favored all along, which is regulation under Subtitle D of RCRA, the non-hazardous section. Now, I want to explain how this is different from the original H.R. 1391, the McKinley bill. Many of my colleagues here today are sponsors of that bill, and the original language would bar any entity, state, federal agency, et cetera, from regulating coal combustion residuals under Subtitle C of RCRA. State associations that regulate municipal solid waste were concerned about this provision because when some coal ash is burned, it can contain higher than permissible levels of contaminants which warrant a hazardous designation. My amendment in the nature of a substitute recognizes this concern, and a similar provision, as I said, is included in the base bill which we are working off of today. I'd refer you to page 3, section 3, maintenance of subsections 4005C, et cetera. Therefore, if any of my colleagues were supportive of the original McKinley bill with some of the modifications in the base bill today, that would be, voting in favor of my amendment today would be very consistent. Mr. Chairman, as I stated in my opening statement, I would like to continue to work with you and my colleagues on this bill, but I think that a vote on this amendment is needed to show the support from both sides on a proposal to regulate coal combustion residue under Subtitle D of RCRA, and I would urge my colleagues to support this amendment.
Would the gentleman yield for a second before I speak?
I would be happy to yield to the gentleman.
You understand that by striking all after the enacting clause and replacing with the original McKinley bill, that the provisions that you have fought for in the amendment which we included would not be in the base bill?
That is correct, but they're not as necessary because it's a different regulatory scheme. If, in other words, the states right now have seen fit to allow this practice, and we don't see anything in this that would make that discontinue. But if we're
and the obviously, I'll yield back to you, and would you yield back your time then? Are you done?
Yield back the balance of my time.
I would then recognize myself now for 5 minutes in opposition to the amendment. This amendment is the text of the original McKinley bill and prohibits the Environmental Protection Agency from regulating coal combustion residuals under Subtitle C. The effect of this amendment is the same as the floor amendment that my colleague from Wisconsin voted against in H.R. 1. The whole reason we're here with this bill is because simply prohibiting action under C is not enough, and it could open beneficial uses for an uncertain regulatory climate. In addition, the amendment only includes certain kinds of waste and not as many as non-hazardous coal combustion waste as are contemplated in the underlying bill. This means that the EPA could come back later and place these unenumerated items under Subtitle C, putting beneficial users in the same bad spot they are in right now. A new C designation removes certain types of waste streams that beneficial users could access to promote more jobs in her state, in my state, and across the country. Moreover, this amendment would hamstring the states because some of them are constrained to take only those actions that are permissible by the EPA. It is also not clear what my colleague would like to see as a disposal replacement, including how we would address surface impoundments, landfills, groundwater testing, and structural integrity issues. While these are clear in the underlying bill, the amendment shoots first and worries about the consequences later. This is the kind of uncertainty that will increase in consumer costs and won't power people's air conditioning in the summer heat or heat in the winter. Finally, the economic analysis Subtitle D proposals that EPA has proposed would cost $22 to $34 billion to the economy and between 39,000 to 64,000 jobs. That's a huge risk to take with 9% unemployment. So I urge my colleagues to oppose.
Would the gentleman yield?
I would yield.
I just want to note that the EPA is going through a very comprehensive process right now, dealing with a lot of the, if not all of the issues you just listed, and this amendment would allow that process to continue. So I think your concerns would be addressed with the agency. But well, I yield back to
reclaiming my time, you have much greater faith in the EPA than I do. So anyone else seeking time? If not, the vote occurs on the amendment offered by my colleague from Wisconsin. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The roll call vote is requested. Roll call is called. If you want to, I'm happy to do that. So I don't know how to. Yes, the gentleman from.
May I make unanimous consent that the vote on the pending amendment be postponed until all time has expired on this legislation, and of course prior to final passage?
If the gentleman would yield. For my colleagues, in essence, we're trying to go through the amendments, roll the votes to the end, cast votes on the amendments, and then on the underlying bill. I have no objection. Gentleman from...
I just want to say, as one that helped write the rule, that it's up to the chairman, and if we roll votes, the rule is such that you, Mr. Shimkus, and Mr. Green. If you have an agreement to roll the votes, that's how it's done.
That's fine.
But you need to get an agreement between you two, and if you decide to do that, then that's just fine. And the vote will be held until at the end.
The Chair, if the gentleman would yield back his time, or if I could, then it's the ranking member, Mr. Green, and I have been in consultation, and we'll go through the amendments. Once the amendments are been offered, we'll then vote on the amendments and roll final passage at the end of the amendments. So having no objection, so ordered. The chair now seeks time for an amendment offering. Who has an amendment? Anyone seeking recognition? Okay. If not, why did we go through that process?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask for 5 minutes.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes. Striking last order.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to think the legislation put forth by the majority that needs some more work, and I'd like to ask council some questions to see if we can highlight some of the issues that weren't addressed in this bill. First of all, council, does the draft bill envision that the EPA would develop revised criteria specific to coal combustion residuals, or would the revised criteria only be which the EPA has already promulgated under 40 CFR Part 258 for the municipal solid waste?
The bill as currently drafted would not prevent EPA from updating Part 258 should it see fit.
Okay. Number two is EPA's role under the draft bill. What is EPA's role under the draft bill? For example, states are to certify that the state would adopt and implement a coal combustion residuals program to the administrator of EPA.
Gentleman, I'll ask my colleagues near the door to take their conversations into the cloakroom so that my colleague can be heard.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sure they're listening to these questions intently. Does the draft bill envision that the EPA would revise or approve that certification from the states? And if not, how does the draft bill envision that the EPA would find the state rules or certification deficient?
The certification is the states basically just saying to EPA that, or they notify the EPA that they're going to do the program, and then they certify that they have the appropriate rules and statutes in place. EPA can, if it's brought to EPA's attention that the states aren't properly implementing the program, EPA sends a notice to the states. The states have a 6-month time period to remedy the deficiencies with, and if at that point EPA does not feel that the deficiencies have been remedied, they would be able to take over the program.
EPA could do that on their own volition. They don't have to have someone to request that.
The bill says if it's brought to the attention of EPA.
Okay, so they could do that in-house.
Presumably.
Okay. Number three, the draft bill envisions only one permit will be enforced at any one time. Under the draft bill, EPA can implement a permit program if the state does not meet certain provisions under the draft bill. However, the bill also indicates that a state can adopt a program after EPA begins to implement a permit program. What's the transition process between an EPA's permit and a state permit?
The typical process is that the existing permits would remain in force until the program has been transitioned from the EPA to the state.
So the initial state permit would still be in effect until EPA's process is complete.
That's correct.
Okay. Number four, the draft bill appears to provide EPA the authority to implement a permit program for coal combustion residuals. If the state does not have a program as described in the draft bill, does this include enforcement provisions? So what authority would EPA have to enforce the program if a state, a good example, if the state does not have a program?
The bill as currently drafted doesn't provide EPA with enforcement authority.
So if half our 50 states don't do anything, the EPA doesn't have any authority over this particular coal combustion residuals.
That's correct.
Would gentlemen yield and follow up on that?
Glad to.
I guess the question is, would the EPA still have general enforcement authority?
They would have authority on their imminent hazard authority under 7003.
Thank you. I thank my colleague.
Okay. Number 5, the draft bill states that the state should maintain an approved program under Section 4005C or authorized program under Section 30006 of RCRA. What is the relationship between this requirement and the remainder of the draft bill? And that is, why is this provision included and what issue does it address?
I'm sorry, what was the second half of your question?
Okay. The draft bill states that states should maintain an approved program under Section 4005C or an authorized program under Section 3006 of RCRA. What is the relationship between that requirement and the remainder of this draft bill? See, there's some confusion in the draft bill that I worry that EPA, we may not be giving EPA the guidance that most of us would like, and I wonder how that would work out in real life when EPA starts to look at it.
The requirement that states have a either an approved MSW plan or an authorized 3006 is a checkoff for this. If the states have such programs currently in place, they are pre-approved, so to speak, to implement and adopt a coal combustion residuals permitting program in the state. And and so long as they maintain those programs, they continue to be able to do those CCR permitting program.
Okay. My last question, Mr. Chairman, is the draft bill provides no guidance on how EPA is to administer, if at all, this authority on Indian lands. Section 4011A only applies to states, which RCRA currently defines to exclude Indian tribes and Indian territories. Is the intent of the bill to give EPA the authority over the Native American lands or the Indian lands?
The bill as currently drafted doesn't address tribal lands.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, these questions highlight some of the issues that I think hopefully we can work together between now and the markup in the full committee. And I hope we have a real opportunity to put a bill together that will have a chance of passing in the Senate, because I think we need to solve the problem of coal ash, and instead of just sending something to the Senate, and hopefully the majority will work with our side before we get to the full committee this week. Now yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back his time.
Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment. Is there a number?
Number 2.
An amendment offered by Mr. Waxman of California.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
The Resource Conservation and Recovery Act has a simple purpose: to protect public health and the environment from unsafe disposal of solid waste. My amendment would bring that purpose into this legislation. This amendment is necessary because without it, the authority of states and EPA could be limited in ways that put human health and the environment at risk. Under the existing language, a state could put in place an insufficient program, one that threatens human health, and so long as they file the required certification, they're done. There would be no way for the EPA to intervene to provide the necessary safeguards. If we adopt this amendment, state plans will have to meet the existing standard for disposal under Subtitle D of RCRA, meaning that they will have to include criteria necessary to protect public health and the environment. EPA will have the authority to step in if states fail to protect public health and the environment, and if EPA steps in, it will have to implement a program that protects public health and the environment. It's that simple. It could mean the difference between a protective regime and one that puts people at risk. So I urge my colleagues to support this amendment.
And the gentleman yields back his time. Does anyone seek recognition in opposition to the amendment? If not, I recognize myself for 5 minutes in opposition. In the beginning of the markup, I highlighted the fact that the Environmental Council of the States, which is the environmental agencies from the states submitted a letter in support of this legislation, just underlining the fact that they feel that this helps them protect the health and the community. This amendment requires coal combustion residuals permit programs to protect human health and the environment, also inserts criteria for the location of landfills. This well-meaning amendment contains language that we feel is unnecessary. Page 3, lines 16 through 19, requires that that state coal combustion residuals program cannot be less stringent than the requirements of the revised criteria. These revised criteria, which are defined on page 13, lines 9 through 13, already are implicit in section 410C, which states the criteria shall be those necessary to protect human health and the environment and may take into account the practical capability of such facilities. The amendment does not add any new requirements for protection on human health and the environment, but could remove some flexibility on the technical feasibility of its application. In addition, the Municipal Solid Waste Program and the Part 258 criteria, the baseline for the coal combustion residue program in the states is based on the requirement that programs be protective of human health and the environment. Many states are already regulating coal combustion residue in manners that is protective of human health and environment. Part 258 also contains criteria regarding the location of coal combustion residue management and disposal structures. This amendment seeks to add items that do not need to be added since they are already picked up by the underlying bill and regulation.
Would the gentleman yield for
I would
question?
be happy to yield.
Is it your understanding then that if a state adopts a position that could be challenged as being unsafe, not protective of the public health and the environment, that EPA could step in and correct it or not approve it on that basis?
Yeah, if the gentleman would yield, they would have to meet the criteria under the bill, which is established in the language. So,
so if they did not meet the criteria and were not protective of public health and the environment, EPA could deny a state's plan.
Well, it would have to be, obviously the state's going to, in essence, certify that they're going to be under the regime, and then someone would have to identify that they're not meeting the standard, then EPA would then have the authority.
Thank you.
And without anyone else seeking recognition, I yield back my time. Anyone else seeking recognition in support or opposition of the amendment? Hearing none, the vote then occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion chair, the noes have it. Gentleman requests a roll call vote, and the roll call vote will be called at the end of the amendment offerings. Are there anyone else seeking recognition to offer an amendment? If there are no further amendments, the clerk will call the roll on the Baldwin amendment.
Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, nay. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts, nay. Mrs. Bono Mack. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Bass. Mr. Bass, nay. Mr. Wada. Mr. Wada, nay. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper, nay. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, nay. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton, nay. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton, nay. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, aye. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow, aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone, aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette, aye. Mrs. Capps. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman, aye. Mr. Shimkus.
Mr. Shimkus votes no.
Mr. Shimkus, nay.
Any other members seeking Opportunity to vote. The clerk will report. I know you're still tallying. The clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that, there were 7 ayes, 9 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to. If there, the clerk will now call roll on the Waxman amendment.
Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, nay. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts, nay. Mrs. Bono-Mack. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Bass. Mr. Bass, nay. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta, nay. Mrs. McMorris-Rogers. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper, nay. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, nay. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton, nay. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton, nay. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, aye. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow, aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone, aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette, aye. Mrs. Capps. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman, aye. Mr. Shimkus.
Mr. Shimkus votes no.
Mr. Shimkus, nay.
And the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that, there were 7 ayes, 9 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to. If there are no further amendments, the question now occurs on favorably reporting the bill to the full committee. All those in favor will signify by saying aye. All those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. The bill is agreed to. I'd like to thank my colleagues for their attention and their work, and I look forward to working with some of my colleagues on the other side for in the interim to see if there's something we can do to be to address some of their concerns. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill approved by the subcommittee today. So ordered. Again, the chair thanks the members and staff. The committee stands adjourned.